When we think about the world of our D&D campaign as a real world, and the player characters are living in that world, then just like real life, they have a place that they live. Whether it's a permanent home or a temporary residence. And when they go to work, finding adventure, they have to travel to their job. Adventurers don't work at home. And while that journey from point A home to point B work can be mundane and uneventful, the world of D&D is filled with dangers, obstacles, and encounters. And sometimes the most deadly encounters and obstacles occur on the way to work. Hello folks, KR King here again, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. Travel in D&D is one of those aspects that seems so obvious that sometimes we don't realize the opportunities that it affords for interesting gameplay. I played recently in an online campaign where the GM said, it takes 3 days to get here and there, and we just there we are. Or they take the traditional random monster thing where they roll every day or at night, and if you get them, you have an encounter. If not, you just move on. I think, like most things in D&D, if you drill down a little bit on travel, you find that there are aspects of it that can really make for interesting gameplay. These are the things you can incorporate that help maintain that vital balance in your game between verisimilitude, the reality of traveling through a dangerous world, and the suspension of disbelief in terms of how often you might meet something or the terrain types and whatever that are restricting travel. So in this video, I'm going to concentrate on walking as kind of the most common means of characters in a D&D world moving around. Then the next video, I'm going to go with things like animals and carts and ships and all sorts of exotic forms of travel. So I'm going to give you some ideas on how to make these various modes of travel not just an engine for generating encounters, but a chance to give some flavor and atmosphere to your world, make it seem more real. So when I think about the various modes of travel in D&D, I tend to divide it into 4 categories. You have the speed of movement, the carrying capacity of that movement, the resources required to do that movement, and then finally the difficulty of terrain for each mode of travel. Now, there's different aspects and ramifications for these 4 things in terms of modes and travel, in terms of their practicality and whatnot, and we'll get to those, but these are kind of the 4 basic building blocks that I use. All right, so we've got those parameters. Let's look at walking in terms of Dungeons & Dragons, because it is the most common form of travel in D&D, and this is for a number of reasons. The first is its tremendous utility. You can walk virtually anywhere on dry land, and you can either cross bodies of water if you've got a bridge, and smaller ones you can swim. And of course you can use magic at times to facilitate walking. And usually the most difficult terrain means walking. They don't take pack animals to the top of Mount Everest. You got to walk there. And it's the same thing in D&D across difficult terrain. You've got wild areas. You don't have a lot of paths. Walking is the best way to move. The other thing is walking is cheap. You don't have to buy or rent a set of legs, and you only have to feed yourself. Now, you have total control over your movement, but what you lose is speed and carrying capacity. So my basic rule of thumb is that you can walk at a normal pace through non-difficult terrain for about 8 hours at 3 miles an hour, so that's 24 miles in 8 hours. You can walk farther than that, but then you start to get into the exhaustion rolls. And then in more difficult terrain, your rate of movement can be halved or even quartered, depending on the terrain. And of course, you can only carry what your strength will allow. This is why bags of holding are such a valuable item. Now, you can hire bearers to go with you in D&D to carry stuff, but again, they're very vulnerable. Good luck hiring someone if you're going into a very dangerous area. Now, there's another aspect of walking in D&D which may seem counterintuitive, and that's that you're often less vulnerable to attack when you are walking as opposed to other forms of transportation. You can often move with greater stealth when walking. When you have animals, they can attract attention either through their smell or the noises they make, both while you're traveling and at night. Now, you might think, I can flee better if I'm on animals, but if you have pack animals, they don't go that quickly. It's also easy to split up when you're on foot and hide out and then regroup. In some sense, you don't go as far, so there's not as much chance for people to get split up and lost. And if you're going to a location where you're going underground into a dungeon, if you've got a bunch of pack animals and stuff, you got to leave them behind, possibly with bearers. That can attract attention. All right, so you've got a group that's traveling by foot through the wilderness, let's say. Think about the obstacles that you can create to make that travel more interesting, and also think about what the actuality of traveling means in terms of the various terrain types, and what those realities mean in terms of the mechanics of the game. So think about mountains, for example. You are usually either going up or you're going down in mountains, and in fact going down can be more difficult owing to balance and muscle memory issues. The act of movement in mountain can cause things to happen. Rock slides, avalanches, and snow. Then you've got areas that can only be climbed with special equipment, and there's limitations in terms of the technology available. Players may have to fly or teleport over certain obstacles. This can cause problems coming back if they don't get a long rest. And with mountains, you can create an area where travel is very specific. You have a narrow valley that they must pass through, severe weather in certain areas where you can't fly around obstacles. And think about the actualities of creatures living in an area where they know there's a valley that has to be traveled through. They're going to watch that area. It's going to be a magnet for anyone who wants to pass by. And always remember the option of volcanic activity. Lava moves very slowly, but it is inexorable, right? And it can go behind players and cut off avenues of movement. So swamps are notoriously dangerous in D&D. Partly owing to the sort of creatures that live there, but also because it's very difficult to move through swamp. You can easily have an area that turns into marsh and the players have to walk waist deep or even neck deep through murky black water. You also have mud pits and quicksand and whatnot in a swamp. You can create situations where the characters, have to use special flat boats or something in certain areas. And again, when you get on the boats, as we'll see when I talk about that, you become vulnerable. Similarly, jungles are difficult to move through because of the thick growth. Often you have to use machetes and whatnot to cut your way. Think about the reality of that. You're going to make a lot of noise. You're going to attract attention as you're hacking your way through. The wildlife that's all around you is going to be reacting to this. So the next time you're walking on a beach, think about how much more difficult it is to walk in sand than on flat ground. Well, this is the same thing in a classic dune desert. Players are going to feel that difficulty as well. And when you're in the desert, anytime there's wind, right, it blows up the sand. It can be hard to breathe, hard to see. When you think about Arctic terrain, you often think about, the South Pole, nothing but penguins and ice. But there's actually other elements of an Arctic environment. Think of the frozen tundra. You've got vast plains blasted by icy winds with no cover. Not only are the players going to be freezing, but think about trying to light a fire under these conditions. So you're in a fantasy world, so you can have an extremely dense forest, perhaps one made completely of briars that cut into anyone and can even inflict disease. And this kind of forest can severely restrict movement. You might have narrow, winding paths that are cut through this kind of forest. The players may have to go single file, or even if they can go two abreast, they're going to be making sharp turns and whatnot. They could be surprised at any moment. And those trails are going to attract attention. All right, so these kind of terrain effects on travel in difficult or exotic terrain are pretty obvious. But don't forget about different travel obstacles and effects that you can have in relatively clear terrain. Rivers are an obvious example. If you make them wide and they go very fast, players are going to have to find an area where they can ford them, either a bridge that's there or ones that they make. And again, bridges are excellent areas for encounter, whether it's a land bridge or some abandoned bridge from a lost civilization. Creatures in the area are going to know that that's a crossing point. They're going to use it too, and they're going to wait there to see who comes. And I mentioned in an earlier video on atmospheric effects, the mist-shrouded gorge is an incredible environment to run, and it makes movement difficult on slippery rocks. But don't forget about a dry riverbed. filled with giant boulders, uprooted trees and whatnot. Very difficult to move along, but if it's going through a ravine, it may be the only way the players can go. And you have the risk of a flash flood coming down. Again, if the players, this is where they have to go, they know this risk, but it heightens the tension of the run. So another classic terrain type that restricts your travel is the moor. Think of the Hound of the Baskervilles type setting. You've got mist, will-o-wisps and whatnot, and of course you've got quicksand and bogs, all of it shrouded in perpetual mist along the ground. And in all of these areas, one of the things that the players may need is a guide. They're going to know where the quicksand pits are, where the creatures might dwell. It may also be an NPC who has enlisted the players to help them find some treasure or some lost keep or dungeon. But they're going to want to keep that NPC alive to find their way in and to find their way back. And if someone knows about this, an enemy group, they may try to harm that NPC to trap the players. And this brings up another thing that occurs in any kind of unusual terrain, but possibly even a clear grassland hex, and that's the risk of getting lost. If you've ever been lost, whether it's in the woods or in the middle of a big city, it's a very disconcerting feeling. So travelers in a D&D world would be very cognizant of the risks of getting lost. And they would be thinking about this whenever they travel outside of a familiar area. Now, obviously, a map can be a tremendous help, but what if you happen to miss a landmark on that map? Or the sun is obscured by gray skies. Now you have character classes like the ranger who can't get lost in their favored terrain and gives you some advantages. Again, you can hire a guide who knows the area. If you're familiar with an area, you're not going to get lost. You can use magical means to find your way. You can climb up into a tree or fly up to look around, see if you can spot landmarks or the mountain range over here to figure out where you are. And of course, there are the standard survival checks to see if you get lost, how much you want to use those, and you can control the DC of those checks, depending on how tricky the terrain is, an endless desert, an area where there are no landmarks or there is perpetual mist, the DC is going to be a lot harder. And the players are going to know this when they enter this area. Now, in terms of meta aspects, you got to be very careful, I think, with having players get lost too much. In the old days, I would have the players draw out their map, right? And I'd be looking behind my screen and I'd tell them what each hex was. If they got lost and they didn't know it, they would draw the map wrong. And then at some point they would discover, oh, the map's not right, we're lost. Well, now they've got to go back. Someone's got to, remake the map and start again. And if this happens constantly, it can be very irritating to the players. So I would be careful about that. Even, in a setting where you've got a map, an electronic map, if you're telling them they want to go northeast, let's say, but in fact they're going northwest, the players then continue to move along there thinking that all the while you're going, oh, they're lost, they don't know. Again, very irritating when the players discover, oh, we have to backtrack or whatever. So you want to be careful. And there's some ways to do this. One of the things is, one, you tell the players this is a difficult, the Valley of Mist is hard to find your way through, so they can prepare themselves, whether it's a guide, whether it's magic, whatever. The other thing that you can do is you can establish early on that when they get lost, they might have a feeling of this or something's not right, so they can intuit, are we on the right track here? And give them a chance to be more careful, move more slowly, whatever, so that they don't get lost. Because again, going slowly is a pain, but nothing's a bigger pain than constantly getting lost. All right, so those are some ideas on how to turn walking into something a little more interesting than just, going from point A to point B, you're there, or random monster, random monster. So the next time, I'm going to talk about traveling with animals, carts, ships, and all sorts of exotic means of travel. But until then, keep playing D&D, folks, and tell somebody else about it.